This is Memo Weekly Review. Thanks for joining me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani, to break down the week's big stories. Hi, Moin, how are you doing?
Hi, Nasim. Always a pleasure to be with you and hope you're well.
I'm fine, thank you. Just before we get underway, I wanted to mention that this is the 50th episode of our weekly review, so which is a bit of a milestone. So we started just under a year ago. So I wanted to just take a moment to thank you for sharing your insights, analysis every week for nearly a year, and also thank everyone that have been watching and tuning in. So please, share our videos and like the memo page. We want to grow this. So thank you, Moin, and thanks everyone to
Well, thank
for
you,
tuning in.
Nasim and Middle East Monitor, for persisting with this, for making every weekly discussion an interesting one and asking the pertinent questions that need to be discussed.
Exactly. We felt that we needed to discuss Gaza in detail as this genocide was unfolding. So thanks to everyone for their support. So I wanted to, unlike some of the other shows, spend most of the time speaking about the ceasefire, its detail, if it will hold, the profile of the Palestinian hostages that have been released, what has been the Trump effect and what will be the Trump effect going forward. We will also end with a discussion about a new poll which shows that some 29%, that's nearly 19 million Americans who voted for Joe Biden in 2020, did not cast their vote for the Democrats because of its position in Gaza. I mean, that's quite extraordinary. I mean, it shows Gaza was their number one priority, and if Biden took a better position, the Democrats would have won. So we'll discuss that as well later on in the show. But let's begin with, as I said, with the actual deal itself. What are the main details? What struck me is that the hostages were in northern Gaza all along, where Israel inflicted more damage than any other part of Gaza, really right under the nose of the Israeli occupation forces, which is quite extraordinary.
Well, we don't know that for sure. We do know that these first three Israeli hostages that were released and surrendered to the International Committee of the Red Cross in the context of the ceasefire agreement, that they were transferred to the Red Cross in the northern Gaza Strip. Whether they had been there all along, or whether they were recently moved there from elsewhere, I think makes your point equally well, because the point here is that Israel has used its search for its captives and its determination to retrieve its captives without an agreement as kind of the main pretext and main argument for why it needed to continue and even intensify its genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip. And now, of course, what we've seen is not only is it only retrieving living hostages as a result of the agreement, but they were either being held or they have been surreptitiously moved to that area of the Gaza Strip, which not only has witnessed the most intense Israeli onslaught of its entire military campaign, that began in October of 2023, but also is currently, up until the very last moment before the ceasefire, was experiencing the most intense violence Israel has yet unleashed on the Gaza Strip in the context of the so-called General's Plan, which we have discussed on several occasions previously.
Mm. Well, what are the profile of some of the hostages that have been released by Israel, the prominent ones? I mean, I saw a number of um, articles and threads on social media showing that many of them are just your average Palestinian women, some very young, some lawyers, activists. They were all detained and taken hostage by Israel. What are some of the key ones that you noticed?
Well, of course, Hamas already in October of 2023 offered Israel two options: to either exchange all Israeli captives for all Palestinian captives in one go, or to do so in stages. And what we now have is an agreement that's being implemented in stages. According to its terms, we do know that it will result in the release of all Israeli captives in the Gaza Strip, whether dead or alive, and whether seized on October 7th, 2023, or in a small number of cases captured in the Gaza Strip in the years preceding that. On the Palestinian side, it remains unclear to me whether all Palestinian captives are ultimately going to be released from Israel's prison system, from its gulag. But in this first stage, or the first installment of the first stage, because uh, releases are meant to take place once a week, or exchanges are meant to take place once a week for every week for the first stage of this agreement, which lasts 42 days. Three Israeli women, who I believe are all civilians, were released. And from the Palestinian side, of course, a larger number were released just because there are exponentially more Palestinian captives who have been in the Israeli prison system for many, many years longer than is the case in the Gaza Strip. And these were primarily civilians, children, or what the BBC would call men who happen to be minors, and women, and also included a number of prominent figures, because of course Hamas did not want to be in the position it was in during the exchange of late November 2023, where as soon as the agreement was supposed to develop into one where more prominent Palestinians were supposed to be released, Israel would balk and withdraw and resume the war. So the most prominent one released in this first week of the first stage was Khaled al-Jarrar, who is a senior leader in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, has spent most of the past 6 years in prison, primarily in administrative detention, which is detention without charge or trial. Spent the last 6 months apparently in solitary confinement until the very moment that she was released, and I suspect many of our viewers will have seen images of her released, where she looks like the grandmother of the woman who was abducted by Israeli forces 6 months ago. Um, uh, Khaled al-Jarrar is not only a very prominent Palestinian politician, she's also an elected member of the Palestinian Authority parliament, and is someone who, about a decade ago, played an important role in the decision by the Palestine Liberation Organization to join the International Criminal Court by endorsing the Rome Statute. If I can just give a little bit of detail here. At the time, the Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, was coming under intense pressure from Palestinian society to join the International Criminal Court. And he said he would only do so if every Palestinian political movement endorsed the decision to do so, so that he wouldn't later be blamed for also exposing Palestinians to arrest or indictment and arrest by the court. And Khaled Jarrar ensured that her own organization, the PFLP, would endorse this decision, and apparently also played a role in helping persuade Hamas to endorse the decision of the Palestinian decision to join the court. And many people, including a number of prominent Israeli journalists, suspect that her travails in Israeli prison are primarily the result of the role she played in um, in setting in motion kind of the whole international criminal court procedure, which of course has now resulted in Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, being an international fugitive from justice. Now, as far as the others are concerned, it includes a Palestinian woman journalist, a woman who was abducted and imprisoned for writing a poem, the kinds of flimsy pretexts for arrest and incarceration in Israel's Gulag system that one would expect from the totalitarian system, and I emphasize the totalitarian system that is Israel's military government in the occupied territories.
And what about Marwan Barghouti? There's reports that Egypt, Qatar, alongside Hamas, using, and I quote, all means available to secure his release as part of a ceasefire agreement. So, is there any stage where we could see Marwan Barghouti being released, and what would that mean for the Palestinian cause?
Well, so Marwan Barghouti is, and sorry, just to preface that by saying the release of Khaled al-Jarrar, and already in the first week, was important, obviously not only for her, and not only for Palestinians generally, but I think will also bolster Hamas because it helps Hamas to demonstrate that they were in this for national and not only factional motivations. In other words, they're not just seeking the freedom of their own incarcerated members and so on, but also national leaders from other Palestinian movements and organizations. Now, this applies even more, of course, to Marwan Barghouti, who is broadly considered the most viable, not only the most viable successor to Mahmoud Abbas when he ultimately departs the scene or is removed from it, but also someone who can already challenge and defeat him in a presidential election in the extremely unlikely event that Abu Mazen, who's now, I think, in the 19th year of his 4-year term, would accept to conduct new Palestinian Authority presidential elections. I don't think his name is going to come up until either the second or third stage of the ceasefire and captive exchange agreement. That's at least my understanding, but this could be wrong. I would make 2 points about it. First of all, Hamas would very dearly like to see him released, not only for the reason that I just explained, but also because Barghouti, in sharp contrast to Abu Mazen, for example, is known to be a proponent of national consensus and someone who believes that Fatah and Hamas, the two largest and most consequential Palestinian political movements, should find a modus vivendi instead of this destructive rivalry that they've been engaged in now since 2006, 2007. But for reasons that I've just explained, also explains why Mahmoud Abbas is dead set against Israel releasing Marwan Barghouti. When Israel refuses to release Marwan Barghouti, it is doing so for a number of key Israeli reasons. It doesn't want a Palestinian leader who has the capacity of uniting Palestinians, who has popular credibility among Palestinians throughout the occupied territories and beyond. It doesn't want a leader like that loose outside prison, but it is also doing so for Palestinian reasons, or rather Palestinian Authority reasons. It is known that Abbas has in the past lobbied Israel not to release him. Marwan Barghouti's wife has accused Abbas and his former chief minion, Mohammed Dahlan, of acting to prevent Marwan Barghouti from being released from Israeli prison. In 2011, in the previous large prisoner exchange agreement between Hamas and Israel, Hamas tried very hard to get Marwan Barghouti included in that and ultimately wasn't able to. This time, I suspect they're going to insist and won't release the last prominent Israeli captive that they hold until Marwan Barghouti is released. And that may well be a sufficient pretext for Israel to call off the finalization of this agreement and a resumption of its genocidal campaign.
Hmm. I think with the case of Marwan, again, it shows that the Israelis were never interested in peace. If they were, they would negotiate with someone like Marwan, who has a broad support within the Palestinian community, and who could deliver peace. And as many analysts say, that Israel is afraid of a Palestinian leader, afraid of someone who can deliver the peace, and instead they prefer to factionalize Palestinians, sow seeds of conflict between Hamas and the PA, which is why Netanyahu, as we famously know, has been supporting Hamas for many, many years just for that purpose, so he can say that I have no partner for peace. Whereas all the partner for peace that you have in prison. So how are Palestinians supposed to deliver the peace that
Well,
everyone
it's
seeks?
it's a very good point, and Israel's agenda and priorities are quite clearly fragmentation for the Palestinians and annexation for Israel. And as you point out, many of Israelis' policies can be very clearly explained and understood through this prism.
Mm. And that's also, I think, is illustrated by the fact that this hostage deal is the same hostage deal as the Qatari foreign minister said afterwards. It's the same deal that was agreed 13 months ago. So it really is a waste of lives, first of all. The hostages could have been returned many, many months ago. So it is, as we've been suspecting, Netanyahu prioritized the genocide and killing of Palestinians and his political career above the hostages. And this is another clear example of that, where Israel prefers to continue aggression and violence against the Palestinians instead of peace. 13 months. And I was surprised the Qatari foreign minister came out and said that as frankly as he did.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because, of course, in the West, the continued captivity of these Israelis in the Gaza Strip is often presented and understood as a primary motivation and justification for the continuation of Israel's genocidal campaign. Whereas, in fact, if their release is really the priority, because you can't have a genocide and an exchange of captives simultaneously. You have to prioritize either one or the other, and if a agreement leading to the release of these captives is a priority, then obviously you would have reached one many months ago. And what the Qatari Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Abd al-Rahman al-Thani said basically is this is the agreement that was for all intents and purposes already in place in December 2023, shortly after the first temporary agreement was reached in November of 2023. And it is exactly the same agreement that Biden presented in May of 2023, and the one that, as we know, Hamas had already accepted in July of 2023. But as you point out, Israel had other priorities.
Mm. Let's turn our attention to who actually can claim to have emerged victorious. I mean, I don't like using the word victory in the context of a genocide. Of course, the people who the genocide has been inflicted on are not really the victors, and the people who are perpetrating the genocide also cannot be claimed to be victors in any shape or form. But saying that, there is jubilation in Gaza and level of sadness in Israel. That mood in itself, I think, says something. And also, the Times of Israel had this article, and I quote, for the first time, Israel just lost a war. And the author cited 14 reasons why Palestinians should be considered the victors, and almost no reason, not a single reason, which can be counted in his estimation, why Israel should be considered the victor. So do you agree with that?
I agree with the first part of your question that in a situation like one we're confronted with now, it's exceptionally difficult for anyone to characterize themselves as a victor. Let's start with the jubilation among Palestinians. That's for two reasons. The most obvious one is that Palestinians believe that Israel's genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip has now come to an end. And, even if that was a temporary pause, of course there would be jubilation, as well there should be, when, if a genocide is being paused or hopefully has even come to an end. You've seen Israel apologists and flunkies all over social media expressing outrage at the Palestinian jubilation. It's so weird, jubilation, an expression of joy that genocide is ending, is being presented by these Israel apologists and flunkies as evidence that there never was a genocide. How they exactly reached that conclusion is beyond me. But there are also more political reasons for this Palestinian jubilation, and that is that Palestinians have politically survived, have not capitulated, have not surrendered, and not only continued fighting until the very last moment, but were able to do so in the farthest northern reaches of the Gaza Strip, in Beit Lahi and Beit Hanun, literally on the boundary between the Gaza Strip and Israel, where Israel was simultaneously inflicting its most severe and intensive military attacks of its entire campaign. And so Palestinians believe that they have not only survived genocide, but also survived politically, survived organizationally, survived even militarily. Now, on the Israeli side of the equation, the feeling of perhaps not necessarily defeat, but at least of failure, relates to Israel's inability to achieve any of its proclaimed objectives. And here we have to remember, not only was there not supposed to be an agreement to end this military campaign, there weren't even supposed to be negotiations about it because Hamas was supposed to be systematically eradicated. Hamas's governance capabilities in the Gaza Strip were supposed to be systematically eliminated. All the Israeli captives in the Gaza Strip were supposed to be retrieved through the application of overwhelming violent force, not negotiations and an agreement. That all has failed. I'll just make one last comment is that Israeli commentators, or at least some of them, are are explaining this failure as the result of the Israeli government's refusal and ability, call it what you will, to put forward a clear political plan or political vision of the post-war scenario. In other words, Israel, for a variety of reasons I won't get into here, was never able to put forward a so-called day after scenario. And this helps explain its failure. On the Palestinian side, I would argue that we also do not yet have a clear Palestinian political vision or a unified strategy about moving forward. And unless and until Palestinians manage to do that, their ability to, let's call it, inflict failure on Israel may well ultimately also result in a Palestinian failure or defeat. I mean, you do have conflicts where both sides fail. And this could be one of them. And the absolute priority for the Palestinians now must be one of formulating a coherent and unified political strategy and vision of where they want to invest the extraordinary sacrifices of the past 15 months to end up in.
And we could end up in a scenario where Netanyahu is still in power, the far-right Israeli government is still in power. They are as popular as they've ever been because of what they perceive to be a success. But also at the same time, Hamas has not been eliminated, which was a clear Israeli goal. And as Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, former U.S. Secretary of State, acknowledged that Hamas has recruited and has almost, I think he put a number, something like 12,000, 20,000, I can't be sure. So really, at the end of the day, after 15 months of a war of annihilation, nothing's really changed, and the underlying issues are still there.
Yeah.
So how do you move forward, and what does it mean for stage 2 and stage 3 of the ceasefire agreement, where later on it says that Hamas will not play a governing role in Gaza? What does that mean for the later stages of the ceasefire deal?
Well, as going back to the Israeli perceptions of Israeli failure, I would divide it into, let's say, two constituencies. You have one constituency which views Israel as having failed because the proclaimed objectives of Israel's military campaign were not achieved, the elimination of Hamas and so on. But then you also have another significant constituency um, that views Israel as having failed, not because it failed to eliminate Hamas, but because it failed to eliminate the Palestinians. In other words, it's team genocide, a growing constituency within Israel that considers anything less than the eradication and expulsion of the Palestinians as a strategic failure. So, as far as Blinken is concerned, I desperately hope this is the last time we have to raise this war criminal's name at all in these conversations. But it's unclear what point he was trying to make, whether he was trying to provide as his parting gift to Israel a pretext and justification for it to resume its genocidal campaign by pointing out Hamas's growth during this genocide, or whether he was trying to send a signal to Israel and perhaps something he can quote in his memoirs when he writes them, which should be named, Secretary of Genocide. But to point out, that in Israel that a political agreement is ultimately necessary. But getting back to the point of your question, the problem with the ceasefire agreement is that not only that it's a staged agreement, meaning it consists of three phases, but that the second and third phases have yet to be negotiated and concluded and finalized. So negotiations over the second phase are supposed to continue until they're concluded. And even if they're not concluded by the end of the first phase, they're supposed to continue. But this is, of course, a very tenuous way of doing things. And it could fall apart. But I would argue the decision about whether this agreement continues or is derailed or abrogated is not a decision that's going to be made by Israel. It is a decision that is going to be made in Washington by the Trump administration. And it's a decision which Israel will have no choice but to accept. So the real question we need to ask ourselves is, the Trump administration, having invested considerable resources and political capital in achieving this agreement in order to ensure a smooth presidential transition in order to ensure that the new president does not have a foreign policy crisis on his plate on day one. Will it attach equal importance to continuing with this agreement and ensuring that phases 2 and 3 are successfully negotiated and implemented, or will it lose interest in this entire issue and allow Israel to go its merry way and resume and perhaps even further intensify its genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip?
Mm. We'll return to some of those points later on. And I like your analysis that Blinken possibly his parting gift has been to grant Israel an excuse to continue the genocide. But in Israel itself, the desire to continue this is actually cannot be underestimated. Ben Gvir, the far-right extremist minister, he quit the government, the cabinet, sorry, because of the ceasefire deal. And there are reports from within the Trump administration as well, saying that Israel will resume fighting in Gaza after phase 1. So it seems like this deal was not really done in any sincere, genuine, with any genuine intention to continue with the deal.
It's very difficult to tell. I mean, what we do know is that the United States was determined to have an agreement prior to the 20th of January, the date of Trump's inauguration, and wanted this agreement to include not only a ceasefire, but also an exchange of captives. We know just as clearly that Netanyahu absolutely did not want this agreement for a variety of personal and political and ideological reasons, one of which is keeping his coalition together. Um, and Israel is the proxy in this equation. It has to sing to Washington's tune. And the message came from Washington, you were going to sign this agreement and you were going to begin implementing it. And that's exactly what happened. The question that remains unanswered is what next? Will Washington now also insist that the second and potentially also the third phases are finalized and implemented? Or will it lose interest and allow Israel to take its own decisions and derail this agreement? Now, regarding Israel's coalition, I mean, Ben Gvir didn't quite put his money where his mouth is. He and his fellow extremists left the government, but made clear that they would not vote against the government if there's a motion of no confidence in the Israeli parliament. So, in the broader scheme of things, his resignation is purely symbolic and won't have any political impact. His ideological twin, Smotrich of the religious Zionism party, remained in the government and is said to have done so with a promise of Israeli escalation in the West Bank, which we're now seeing in the Jenin refugee camp and settler pogroms elsewhere, but has also warned that if the war, the genocide against the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip does not resume, he will not only leave the government, but he will also work to bring it down through votes in the Israeli parliament. The problem with these people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich is, they've been indulged for so long. They actually believe that Israel is a country that can act independently of the United States. They actually believe that they can take their own decisions and can ignore what comes out of Washington. Well, depending on the attitude of the Trump administration, they could be in for a very rude awakening.
Well, they actually believe God is on their side, God is supporting them, and this is God doing also their bidding. This is what they also believe.
Well, and in some cases that
Not
they
very
are
different to
God.
Al Qaeda, not very different to Al Qaeda or ISIS in psychologically, that is. But in any case, I mean, Should we look to the ceasefire agreement with Lebanon as a test case? So the deadline for Israel to withdraw from Lebanon is Monday, 27 January. So could we look to that as a test case to see if Israel really does follow through with its commitment under a ceasefire deal?
Yes and no. I mean, what happened in Lebanon is that on the one hand, you had a ceasefire agreement, but then you also had the side agreement between the United States and Israel that basically consisted of a U.S. authorization to Israel to ignore the agreement that it had just signed and to do as it pleases within Lebanon and to continue its attacks in Lebanon. And what we've seen is systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure in southern Lebanon, a whole series of air raids and drone attacks and so on that have killed quite a few Lebanese. Um, but the Biden administration is no longer with us. So this kind of unconditional, total, uncritical support for anything and everything Israel does anywhere is also no longer with us. There have been many suggestions that there was also a bilateral U.S.-Israeli side agreement as part of the Gaza ceasefire. I haven't seen the evidence. You know, when people say that Trump has agreed to allow Israel to continue its violence and in the West Bank, well, it was already doing so. When they talk about the Trump administration potentially authorizing Israeli annexation of West Bank territory. That was already on the agenda and on Trump's radar before this whole ceasefire agreement got into place. So it's not clear to me that there has been any agreement. And it really depends. Again, the key factor here is not Israel, but Washington. In Lebanon, Washington indulged, and I would argue even encouraged, Israel to routinely violate the ceasefire in order to seek to impose its conditions on Lebanon. In Gaza, the U.S. may take a similar attitude that it will indulge Israeli violations of the ceasefire, like the murder of this 15-year-old child in Rafah over the weekend. Or, you know, if we are to believe Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, he will be going to the region and going not only to the region, but also to the Gaza Strip to ensure that the agreement is upheld and implemented. Um, we're now in a very different world than that in which a U.S. administration thoroughly committed to genocide ruled the roost in Washington. Um, the genocidal gang is no longer with us. We're now faced with a new administration, and in the coming weeks, we will find out is it equally devoted to genocide as its predecessor, or for whatever reason, will it pursue significantly different policies?
A report that backs up your claim is by a number of Arab officials who were part of the negotiations, and they came out and said that Trump envoys swayed Netanyahu more in one meeting than Biden did in all year. And that's a direct quote. That's quite astonishing. I mean, I'm actually looking forward to not ever discussing Biden or Blinken. But this probably is the last show where we will discuss them. So, what has
Thank
been the
God.
Trump effect, and and how will history judge both Biden and Blinken, given that there is a consensus that Trump moved the needle in one meeting more than Biden did in all of the past 15 months?
Look, what happened is very straightforward. You know, it's the U.S.-Israeli relationship is ultimately a relationship between a superpower and a regional proxy. And all Trump did is what superpowers have habitually done with the regional proxies. It gave Netanyahu his marching orders, and Netanyahu was powerless to stop it. According to reports, his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, told Netanyahu, "You either sign and implement this agreement, or we will find another prime minister of Israel who will do so." And lo and behold, the following day, Netanyahu accepted the very same agreement that, with U.S. support and encouragement, he had been rejecting for over a year or almost a year. And that's all that it really is, that simple. And the Biden administration's legacy will be one that was thoroughly aware of Israel's extraordinary dependency on the United States, militarily, politically, and diplomatically, as one that made a conscious choice not to use any of that leverage, and instead chose to not only unconditionally support Israel's genocide, but became complicit in it by actually encouraging its intensification and encouraging the expansion of Israeli aggression across the region.
There are, of course, those who, of course, the cessation of a genocide, nothing should be said and done to diminish that point in itself. But that said, there are those who will say this will also come at a cost for the Palestinians.
Yeah, of course.
A leading analyst at Al Jazeera, he said, and I quote, "Mark my words, Trump may have forced Netanyahu's hand on the ceasefire deal, but the incoming president will reward Israel with recognition of its future annexation in the West Bank and through the normalization deal with Saudi Arabia." So the question is, I mean, what has Trump promised in return? One of the key figures during the inauguration sitting behind Trump was Miriam Edelson. She donated something like 100 million to Trump, and during his first administration, he delivered the Golden Heights and also recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And already we are seeing in the West Bank that settlers have been emboldened. They are carrying out what seems like pogroms, burning villages and homes. So if they were not drunk on impunity before, they must feel like, nothing's going to stop them from terrorizing Palestinians. So there is that element to Trump that he will be supporting Israel, offering ironclad support. So, what has Trump given in exchange?
Look, there's been a lot of talk about the significance of Trump in his first day of office, revoking the Biden administration's sanctions that it placed upon, I think, a dozen um, Israeli settlers and settler organizations. That was meaningless to begin with. I mean, these sanctions were the equivalent of putting a band-aid on a stage 4 malignant tumor and then coming back and claiming the patient died because you removed the band-aid. So it's absurd. It was pure, meaningless, symbolic politics meant to camouflage the US's total involvement and support in Israel's annexationist project to begin with. So that's number one. Secondly, um, there have been multiple reports that regarding the Trump-Adelson relationship, that Miriam Adelson contributed, I believe it was $100 million to Trump's electoral campaign in exchange for a commitment by Trump to support Israeli annexation of the West Bank. Well, if we assume for the sake of argument that these reports are correct, and they very well may be, um, the most obvious observation is that these agreements were made many months ago. So clearly, were not made in the context of rewarding Israel for signing the ceasefire agreement. Because, we've been talking about these supposed Trump-Adelson agreements now for the better part of half a year, if not longer. And the third point is, you know, you trust any commitments provided by Trump at your own peril. Excuse me. Um, he may well have made those commitments to Miriam Adelson, but he already has her money. So whether he now fulfills his end of the bargain or not is entirely up to him. And, if he doesn't fulfill commitments that he made to Adelson, well, that puts her in very large company because he's behaved similarly with virtually every other political or business associate he's dealt with. I think one of the key relationships to monitor moving forward is not so much the Israeli-US relationship, but rather the US-Saudi relationship, because Trump and a number of his minions have emphasized their desire to move forward with Saudi-Israeli normalization. And a lot will depend on the message that Washington now receives from the Saudis. Uh, will will the message from Riyadh be, you have to ensure that the ceasefire holds, or else we can't move forward with this? Will the message from the Saudis be, we are no longer interested in normalization, or we don't believe the time is right for normalization, so let's ditch that idea and focus instead on a bilateral US-Saudi agreement? Or will the message from Mohammed bin Salman be, yes, let's do this, but this can only work if there is serious movement towards an end to occupation, and to basically send a firm message to Washington in this regard? I think the jury's out. I think the more likely scenario is that the Saudis will propose a bilateral US Saudi deal. The Americans may want to expand it, and then they'll have to pay the price. But again, this is speculation about a situation that is likely to develop quite soon.
Let's end on this final question. I mean, I did say I did not want to speak about Biden, but this is such a big story. So unfortunately, we have to mention him one last time, and it happens to be the last
One
question.
last time.
Yeah, one last time, and this, it really goes to show the level of support he has been willing to give and the sacrifice he has made um, to continue supporting Israel in its war of annihilation. So, there's a new YouGov poll that came out last week, and it showed that 19 million Biden supporters who voted for him in 2020 um, basically did not vote for him this year. And well, sorry, last election, and the key reason they cited was the genocide in Gaza and Biden's position on that. So that, of course, um, raised a lot of questions. Many commenters would have said, Gaza is way down on the list of priorities of voters, but it wasn't. This was their number one issue above the economy, above immigration, for 19 million people in the US. And if they had come out and voted, Biden would have most likely won the election. So Biden literally lost an election and allowed Trump to, in Biden's view, Trump is a threat to democracy. So in the long term, you could say that Biden sacrificed American democracy because he sees Trump as a threat to democracy for the sake of Israel, for the sake of Israel being able to continue its genocidal war on the Palestinians. That's a huge indictment, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, in 2016, the Democratic establishment essentially took the decision that they'd rather have Trump in the White House than allow a figure like Bernie Sanders to win the Democratic primaries. And in this year, again, they considered retaining the support of their billionaire donors and maintaining their unconditional support of Israel's genocide more important than winning the election. Regarding this poll, it does seem very credible. But of course, just because a respondent says that the Gaza genocide is the main reason they did not vote for Biden, doesn't mean that that there weren't also other reasons that would have prevented them from voting, even if there hadn't been a Gaza genocide, and doesn't necessarily mean that they would have voted and would have voted for Biden in its absence. But who would have thought that we would reach a point with the U.S. public opinion where it would appear that perhaps the margin of error between winning and losing the White House can be explained by U.S. support for Israel and by solidarity with Palestinians on account of Israel's genocidal campaign against them. It's my takeaway from this poll is less about its, let's say, its technical political implications, because of course the U.S. has a very bizarre electoral system, going back to the constitutional arrangements that were made in the late 18th century to accommodate slavery and so on. It's not a popular vote as you have in other countries, but the idea that for U.S. public opinion, this is now a live and real issue with political consequences. That, I think, is of enormous strategic significance.
I did say what last question, but I have to ask this final question. I mean, we have turned the page, so we need to mention that in this show. Trump's inauguration yesterday, it was quite, how should I put it? I mean, if he wasn't condemning, denouncing the previous administration, Biden, he was issuing threats to everyone around the world. That was the main tone of his speech. And afterwards, we saw Elon Musk at a rally, allegedly performing the Nazi salute. I mean, is this the tone for the next 4 years? Of course, we'll be covering everything in detail. And in Musk's defense, I think ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, issued a statement in Musk's defense saying that he didn't really. Let's start on a good note. He wasn't really doing the Nazi salute. So, what do you make of that? Given the fact that ADL and Musk have been at have been at wars a number of times before. ADL accused Musk of being anti-Semitic and whatnot. So, how did you view Trump, President Trump, inauguration speech, Musk's alleged Nazi salute, and also the ADL coming to Musk's defense, which was quite extraordinary?
Yeah, I mean, Trump performed exactly as one expects, President bread and circus, as I like to call him, hyperbolic, making threats left and right that one doesn't know whether to take seriously or not, because he says weird things all the time. I will say I watched part of the inauguration, and the part that struck me the most is at one point in his inauguration speech, he spoke essentially taking credit for the freedom of what he called not Israeli hostages, but hostages in the Middle East. And then the sustained applause turned into a standing ovation. And as it went on, Biden and Harris were left with no choice but to, very much against their will, be the last ones in the room to stand up and
Only
join.
time they did that, by the way. There was a lot of
Yes,
standing ovation, a number of them,
yeah,
but that was the only standing ovation where Biden and Harris stood up as well.
yes, and they were kind of forced to participate in a standing ovation, acknowledging Trump's role in this development to the detriment of their own. It was I believe the final and, in my view, very welcome humiliation of Biden as he exits the White House. As far as Musk is concerned, I mean, do we really need evidence that he is a fanatic, radical right winger? Look at only in the case of Germany, he's actually supporting the neo-Nazi party. He's very open about it. He's not only supporting them, he's saying that they're the only ones who can save Germany, just like a certain corporal approximately a century ago also believed that his party was the only one that could save Germany. So, as a disinformation specialist, Mark Owen Jones pointed out on social media, if it walks like a Nazi and talks like a Nazi and salutes like a Nazi, then it is a Nazi. Unless, of course, you're the Defamation League and your criteria about whether something is or is not Nazi has nothing to do with the salutes you give or the statements you make or who you support, but the sole criteria is, are you pro-Israel or not pro-Israel? And it will be solely on that basis that we will provide you either with a kosher certificate that you're not an anti-Semite, regardless of how many Nazi salutes you give and regardless of your political associations and so on, or we will denounce you as being an anti-Semite, even if you're Jewish. So this is how these Israel apologists and flunkies work. It always has been that way, but particularly under its current management, the Defamation League, which, by the way, let's not forget, used to be a espionage agency operating on behalf of the white minority regime in South Africa, which, of course, is a regime that spawned Elon Musk. Um, uh, Under its current management, the Defamation League has a very clear policy of prioritizing criticism of Israel over the irrational hatred of Jews. And so, going out and saying, this was absolutely, don't believe your eyes. This was not a Nazi salute. And the reason it wasn't a Nazi salute is because Musk is pro-Israel, is effectively what they're saying. That's where we are today.
Extraordinary stuff, Mouin. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, joining me, Nasim Ahmed, for our weekly review show. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Mouin, again, and see you next
Thank
week
you.
for another review show, memo review show. Bye-bye.